We're super excited to have Iola Hughes from Benchmark on the show today. SEIA has entered into a new partnership with Benchmark to create what we're calling the Energy Storage Market Outlook Report moving forward. This is a quarterly report. Really excited about what this data is going to show the industry about the outlook for energy storage moving forward.
Yeah, I've been at SEIA a long time, and we don't often have new research offerings at this scale. It's really, really cool to see. We've obviously been doing SMI, the Solar Market Insight Report, for more than a decade at least. And the fact that we're sort of adding this as a resource for the industry and for our sort of advocacy purposes really points to the critical sort of centralization of storage within this conversation. Like we can't really have conversations about policy or grid or the future of American energy without talking about storage, and we're now able to really ground it in some exciting and hard data about where this market is going. So excited to dig into it.
Yeah. One of the big headlines from this research is that 600 gigawatt hours of energy storage is expected to be installed by 2030, and that's huge. And there's a bunch of reasons for that, but one of the most exciting things about the energy storage market is that it's tech neutral. It doesn't matter what kind of energy you're pairing it with. It will put downward prices on costs. It will improve reliability. So it's a win-win situation all around for not just grid operators and ratepayers, but policymakers as well.
Yep. Yeah. And I hope our industry is watching closely, and there's a lot of really exciting forecast data and a lot of market opportunity out there. So some good data points to dig into.
Iola Hughes from Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. We're really happy to have you here. As our listeners may not know, we have just entered into a new partnership with Benchmark to produce a terrific new energy storage market content on behalf of the industry. So let's first have you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Benchmark.
Thanks very much, Steph, and great to be on the podcast. So my name's Iola Hughes. I'm head of research at Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. We're a price reporting agency and research firm focused predominantly on the lithium-ion battery supply chain, as well as a few adjacent industries such as copper and rare earths. We essentially track the entire ecosystem from raw materials from the mine all the way through to the grid, looking at the various subcomponents of the supply chain, from the midstream cathode and anode all the way through to end use applications in EVs, and energy storage, of course, being a key application that we spend a lot of time looking at.
Well, let's just dive right into the Energy Storage Market Outlook Report. This is the very first report. Tell us what you found, and tell us what some of the goals were for this report.
Yeah, sure. So very exciting to have the first launch of the Energy Storage Market Outlook. This has been a kind of long time coming. We've been working with SEIA for a while to get this all going. So really exciting to have this first release. Essentially what the report is, it's a quarterly data-driven snapshot into the US storage market. It breaks down installations by utility scale, commercial and industrial, and residential applications, as well as a lot of information on chemistry trends and manufacturing shifts. And of course, we spend a lot of time talking about policy. There's been a lot of policy changes over the last year in the US market that have had a really kind of pivotal impact on the storage industry. So really unpacking those trends and their impact on storage installations in the coming years. In terms of, I guess, headline findings, the key things that we discuss in the report are firstly around overall installations. So in 2025, we saw 57 gigawatt hours of storage installed in the US market, which was a annual year-on-year increase of 29%. And really notably, 4 times higher than installations just 3 years ago.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So I'd love to just dig into some of these other top lines. One of the things I find the most interesting is some of the sort of manufacturing trends, and especially with EV manufacturers sort of pivoting towards stationary storage and some of the other sort of supply chain trends. So if you could just sort of touch on what we're seeing as far as U.S. manufacturing and sort of the battery supply chain, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the changes that we've seen here really are impacted by two key reasons. So, the first one being the reduction in the outlook for the EV market. So, there's been a lot of investment in the US over the last few years since the introduction of the Inflation Reduction Act, which really incentivized automakers in the US market to firstly electrify and start selling more EVs, but also to source batteries locally via the 30D tax credit, which was the EV consumer tax credit, which really had strict requirements on the sourcing of your batteries. So that's one element that was really kind of driving this investment in the past. And the 30D tax credit has now been removed. So some of that incentive has gone away. We've also seen big overhaul of things like the EPA emission standards, the California Air Resource Board penalties. And so the outlook for now for EV sales is severely cut and reduced from even kind of 2 years ago. So you have all these batteries and cell manufacturers which were planning to come online to supply the EV market, which suddenly looking around going, okay, where is the opportunity elsewhere that we can still build in the US and we can still tap into the various tax credits? And this is where storage comes in. Storage is going through really strong growth. We also have now seen the introduction of there's a domestic content adder, which has always been in place as part of the investment tax credit. But then you've also got increasing rules around prohibited foreign entities supplying essentially the equipment at these facilities in qualifying for a tax credit. And what that means is that integrators and developers in the US market are now increasingly having to look towards domestic cell supply in order to qualify for credits going forwards. And cell manufacturers essentially are pivoting to deal with this. And notably, if we compare January 2025 to January 2026 in terms of the 2030 headline pipeline capacity figure, that's increased by over 100%. So a real pivot in just a short time.
So despite actions in Washington targeting clean energy, we expect through this new research that over 600 gigawatt hours of energy storage, I had to say it again, 600 gigawatts of energy storage is expected to be installed by 2030. Make that real for our listeners.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, ultimately, in the US, we're seeing increasing electricity demand across the board. We're seeing rising electricity prices across the board. And we're also seeing a higher penetration of renewables in various states. Storage really kind of fits in to help alleviate a number of these issues, from providing grid stability to helping manage electricity prices, and also allowing and enabling this electricity demand growth. So particularly when we talk about things like the growth coming from data centers, there are significant issues around congestion on grids. There are issues around getting access to power, and batteries can kind of slot in and help with a lot of these issues in bringing speed to the grid, speed of access to the grid, and also helping manage some of those electricity costs on the way.
This is a little bit of a weedy question, but how do you forecast?
Yeah, sure.
Something
So
like that?
yeah, so we look at it from a lot of different angles. So what we start with is our project database. So we have a database which tracks over 9,000 projects globally that are either have been built or are in the pipeline. So they could be in a very early stage, just in a proposal, or they could be entering construction, or all the way through to coming online. And we track this as our kind of pipeline for the near term. And this really gives us a good view into what's due to come online or what's been announced to come online in the next 2 years. What's in the pipeline isn't always equal to what's actually going to come online. If we look at January 2025, what was in the pipeline to be completed in 2025 versus what actually did, we saw about 60% of projects actually come online on time. There are delays, there are cancellations, things kind of disappear from the pipeline that maybe were originally planned. And so that gives us a kind of good read into what's going to be happening in the next 2 years. Beyond that, we have to look at kind of the more fundamentals of the market. So we're considering things like the build out of renewables. We're considering congestion in different grids. We're considering the overall electricity demand picture, and really kind of drawing those all together to provide our long-term view of storage demand.
Right. So the biggest challenges, this speaks to why policy certainty matters so much. And two areas really pop out: trade, policy certainty, and permitting. Are there any other areas that you track when you're looking at these findings?
I think one of the things that we always consider is the economics, and that's ultimately going to be one of the key drivers for how much storage is installed. If you look at cell prices and system prices over the last few years, they've experienced a really rapid decline, and that's ultimately because a lot of that supply has been coming from the Chinese market at a very low cost. We're now in a situation where we have a ever-changing tariff environment, which can obviously have big implications for the cost. We then also start to see manufacturing coming online in the US, but there's uncertainty around what price point that will be at. There's uncertainty around whether manufacturers in the US, for example, on the cell side, will be able to qualify for the 45X production tax credit, which has really been put in place to support cell manufacturers in the US. But if that's not possible because of the sourcing situation around the cathode and the anode, which is heavily reliant on China at the moment, that could also have a big implication on the cost as well. So the economics is definitely something that we keep a close eye on, all the way back to the lithium price, which we, of course, track very closely at Benchmark.
Right. Just one more question before I move on that. And I think as a limitation, as a policy limitation, including economics is really important. But I want to also point out that demand is so high that markets essentially will drive outcomes. So the economics of demand, I also would put into the category of increasing that forecast without being a subject matter expert on any level. I think it's really important to point out that demand across all market segments is going up for storage because, the reliability of pairing renewable energy with storage is something that people want, whether we're looking at hyperscaler deployment for these data centers or all the way down to residential storage. So I'd love to dig in a little bit further on that, but go ahead, Colin.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear sort of, in addition to some of the policy and the sort of supply chain pricing impacts, what you're looking at in terms of utility programs or utility demand and uptake. Obviously, with the sort of flattening of the curve that you've mentioned on the sort of increased renewable penetration on the grid. There's all these different sort of questions around the benefits that storage can provide above and beyond simple sort of electricity capacity. So just wondering, what sort of that utility demand picture looks like. And obviously that's variable across the country, but just would love to dig into that a little bit too.
Yeah, sure. So the utility scale market is really the driving force behind storage in the US. So looking at last year, we saw just under 50 gigawatt hours installed out of that overall 57 gigawatt hour figure. So it really is the driving force here. That at the moment is relatively localized. So if we consider kind of the leading states, you have California, Texas, Arizona really being the top three there. And then a kind of whole spattering of other states which are really just emerging. Outside of those top three markets, interestingly, last year we saw New Mexico, Idaho, Oklahoma, and Wisconsin all deploy over 1 gigawatt hour in 2025. And that really was on the back of increased solar deployments that we are seeing across those states. There's a lot of, opportunity across the broader US market as new markets open up to storage, as kind of policy realigns to enable storage to be installed in a more kind of profitable way. Some of the, interesting things that we are also kind of keeping tabs on are the trends that we see around the average duration of the projects. So this is something that can be very localized on a state by state basis. So In Texas, we typically see an average duration of 2 hours. In California, we typically see an average duration of 4 hours. Arizona, similarly, around the 4 hour mark. And that comes down to essentially what the batteries are being used for. But as a market shifts and as a market progresses, and ultimately as battery prices come down as well, increasingly there's an argument for longer duration batteries. And we're already seeing that be the case. In California, we've seen projects at the 6, 8, and even 10 hour mark. And starting to see these batteries coming through, that can have huge implications for your battery demand because, if Texas market suddenly became a 4 hour market, that would, increase the forecast massively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Switching over to that was a great sort of overview of the utility scale market, and switching over to the residential side. One of the things that we've been talking about a lot is the sort of pivot to storage among the residential solar industry, given the expiration of the 25D tax credit, and both installers and customers really thinking about this as kind of like an energy storage first decision, and then sort of adding on generation on top of it to sort of serve the battery, but the battery being kind of the primary benefit to the homeowner and to the sort of customer experience. So we'd just love to hear your sort of take on. Obviously, there was a big jump in the storage capacity on the residential side in 2025. What we're looking at in the forecast and what sort of trends we're seeing there.
Yeah, and I mean that really is kind of drawing parallels to what we're seeing in the utility market as well. So, this with the solar tax credit going away, but the storage one remaining in place, we really expect that when solar is installed, the incentive to install storage alongside it is incredibly strong because then you could at least claim the tax credit on the storage part and kind of spread that across your solar and storage project, which is definitely interesting to see. On the resi side, yeah, absolutely. We saw a very strong growth in 2025, more than 50%, and that was really on the back of the expiry of the 25D tax credit. Increasingly, like I think the general consensus is that 26 is going to be a pretty weak year for both resi, solar, and storage because of that removal of the tax credit. There are a number of things kind of in the works which do have the potential to soften that blow. So one of them would be a shift towards third-party ownership structures, where essentially you'd be looking at, the individual consumer doesn't own the battery, instead they're leasing the system, and then you have kind of an overall company who owns all the systems who could still potentially claim some sort of tax credit. So there are potential kind of workarounds. I think a lot of those are in the relatively early stages, and still some things to be kind of ironed out with the guidance and how those kind of tax credits are distributed. On the kind of flip side of that, I think the underlying theme for residential storage is still very strong. The trend of increasing electricity prices. We see blackouts occurring in various states on the back of things like storms. Definitely incentivize the use of batteries. And again, going back to the economics point, if the price makes sense, we'll see more of them being installed.
Well, and it's also storage is tech neutral. So it doesn't matter. We're not just talking about deployment around clean energy. It can be used in many, many applications.
Yeah.
And that's also why I think it was strategically left out of OB3. And, it's one of the sort of optimistic viewpoints of this administration moving forward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have one of the nerdier questions that I'm fascinated by with this report, and that's sort of the chemistry side and the evolution that we're seeing in different battery technologies. So would love for you to touch on kind of, it seems like there could be a pretty significant switch to different chemistry technologies coming in down the pipeline with, a vast majority of the current capacity in a lithium ion sort of formation, but seeing a lot of pipeline growth in other technologies. So we'd just love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, LFP is really dominating this space, but it hasn't always been the way. If we kind of rewind probably 3-4 years now, we still saw a good mix of nickel-based cathodes, lithium-ion cathodes being used, those nickel, manganese, cobalt cathodes. And really that was because this market was acting as a bit of a surplus to the EV market,
Mm.
rather than being its dedicated own kind of growth market. That really has flipped over the last few years, and we've seen a lot of innovation around the LFP cells. Um, the design of the cells themselves has really shifted over the last few years. We went from a couple of years ago a 280 amp hour prismatic cell, and now we're seeing 600 amp hour cells. So essentially, kind of three times the size the actual
Hmm.
prismatic cell being deployed in certain markets. And because of that innovation at the cell level, that has had really big implications at the system level as well. So you've seen the average 20-foot container go from a kind of 3 megawatt hour energy density to well over 6 megawatt hours today, which has huge implications for things like the project economics, because suddenly your land costs have come down, you have less
Hmm.
components and all that sort of thing. So right now it really is a story of LFP dominance. Um, in the US market, we do still see a little bit of the nickel-based chemistries being used, particularly from some players like Samsung who haven't yet got their LFP lines up and running, so they're still supplying the nickel cobalt NCA chemistries to the market. Interestingly, over the next few years, if we look at the longer term pipeline, we do start to see a bit more of a mix coming through. Sodium ion batteries are certainly on the pipeline. A lot of that activity is kind of focused in China at the moment, but there are a few key players in the US who are also working on sodium ion. And then you get into the realm of, I guess, more novel technologies, things like flow batteries, metal air batteries, zinc batteries, that all have the potential to have a use case within storage. But ultimately, I think our long-term view is LFP's dominance, but you will start to see these other chemistries coming through, particularly when certain use cases make sense to have a different chemistry. So one of the good examples of that would be sodium ion batteries perform much better at extreme temperatures. So if you're looking at installing your battery in Alaska, for example, sodium ion could be a good opportunity there.
Could you dig into maybe the sort of supply chain implications there too? With obviously you all have a deep background in sort of the mining and the mineral aspects of this. So with all these sort of emerging chemistries, um, what does that mean, or is that sort of driven by any trends globally in terms of sort of where we're sourcing these critical minerals?
Yeah, so I guess it's a bit case by case. If we just think about sodium ion first, um, sodium is incredibly abundant. It could potentially come from anywhere. Um, Other parts of that supply chain and where things like the cathode manufacturing and the anode manufacturing is currently, it ultimately is quite dominated by the Chinese market. But there is potential that could be done outside of China. There's several players working on hard carbon, which is the anode material, outside of the Chinese market. And then for cell manufacturing, again, right now it's very dominated by China, but there are some players such as Peak Energy working on this in the US market. Other chemistries, things like the zinc batteries that we see from certain players, these have 100% kind of US supply chain, which is obviously
Hmm.
a great selling point for them. Um, and yeah, some of the other chemistries that we see, bit of a mixed bag, but generally it's still quite a lot of the supply chain, even across the novel technologies, that is focused on the Chinese market. Um, Going back to LFP slightly, and maybe just to dig into that in a bit more detail, we do see, a big push for the onshoring of that midstream part of the supply chain. There
Hmm.
are several players who are working on LFP cathode manufacturing in the US, but the timelines for that are typically around 2028. So there is this kind of bridge period where supply will need to continue coming from elsewhere.
We've gotten into a lot of details. Would love to just sort of maybe step back as we wrap up here and just hear from you. Like, what was surprising to you in going through the analysis for this report? Was there anything that like really stood out as being a big surprise, or sort of the biggest takeaway for the future?
So one thing that we keep track of closely is the projects that are coming through, and as a good metric for how a market is growing, one thing we like to keep an eye on is gigascale projects. So these are individual projects over 1 GWh. And these have really come from non-existent a few years ago to starting to make a mark on the market. So in 2024, we saw 4 gigascale projects installed in the US, and that accounted for 13% of the overall market. In 2025, we saw 7 such projects installed, and that accounted for 21% of the market. And then in 2026, we currently have 25 of these projects in the pipeline. And if they were to all come online, along with everything else in our pipeline, they would account for 36% of the overall kind of battery demands for 2026. So these projects are the ones that can really swing the needle. They're the ones to keep a close eye on. And these are the projects which will come in at the lowest economics. They really have economies of scale to work with, and really start to make a big impact on installations.
Yeah, it's exciting.
That is super interesting. Before we ask you how people can dig deeper into these results, I want to see if there's anything you can say about how the US market compares globally. What does the rest of the world look like when it comes to energy storage?
Yeah, so the US comes in as number 2. The Chinese market is kind of leading the way. China's had some very interesting policy over the last few years, which has really incentivized storage. They had a renewable pairing mandate in place. So if you installed solar or wind, you also had to install storage alongside that. And that really drove the market over the last few years. That policy has actually been removed now, but they've replaced it with a few other policies which are really driving things through. Other markets which are really interesting and starting to emerge in a very strong way are those where we see very strong solar deployment. So think Chile, the Middle East, Australia, and these are all countries where we see very large projects, so gigascale projects being kind of the norm. But yeah, the US is doing well. It's up there as a leading market, and it's ultimately doing the most as well to onshore the manufacturing picture as well, bringing system manufacturing, bringing cell manufacturing, and then also working on those other parts of the supply chain too.
Great.
Do you have sorry to cut in here, but and if you don't have this handy, that's fine too. But in terms of the market segment sort of breakdowns globally, where does the U.S. stack in terms of the residential storage market, or just sort of generally is that a similar picture?
Yeah, so the kind of leading residential markets are actually Europe. We've seen a number of countries have very supportive subsidy schemes, which have really driven things forward. Germany and Italy being kind of notable ones there. Australia is also an incredibly strong storage market. So actually last year we saw in the residential market over 6 GWh installed in Australia compared to 3 in the US. So given the population of Australia is a lot smaller than the US, that gives you a sense of that scale there.
Yeah, well, we've got some catching up to do. That's good.
Yeah. One more wonky question. Well, what would you say to U.S. policymakers, whether they're federal policymakers or state and local policymakers, on the benefits of energy storage?
The benefit, I mean, they are. There's a very long list. I think stability is the biggest one. Ensuring that basically all this new load growth, which is coming in the next few years, is able to be added in a sustainable way that doesn't result in blackouts, that doesn't result in surging electricity prices, and that's got to be the biggest one.
No matter what type of energy generation you're looking at.
Exactly.
Right. Iola, this has been very eye-opening for us, and I think our listeners are going to be very intrigued by all the things that you had to say. How can people use this content? How can they access this content in their own companies?
Yeah, sure. So the data and reports the report rather can be accessed through the SEIA website and then the respective benchmark website. You can download the executive summary for free to find out the high level findings, and then you can access the full report, which includes the more granular breakdowns, things like chemistry and the forward looking view of the market. And it's updated on a quarterly basis, so it's not a one-off. We'll have another one coming in 3 months' time.
Well, yeah, thank you so much. We're really excited about this partnership and looking forward to many more of these reports to come. So we'll check back in a future edition and see how things have evolved.
Yeah, sounds great.